Today is Wednesday, June 5th, and this is a Fairewinds Energy Education Podcast. Today, we are joined by Akio Masumura, the former Special Advisor to the United Nations Development Program, the founder and Secretary General of the Global Forum of Spiritual and Parliamentary Leaders for Human Survival, and the Secretary General of the 1992 Parliamentary Earth Summit Conference in Rio de Janeiro. We are also joined by Chiho Koniko, a Fairewinds Energy Education Board member, and Arnie Gundersen, Fairewinds Chief Engineer. Thank you all for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for inviting me here first time in Vermont.
Yes, thank you.
Today's discussion will focus on how the accident of Fukushima Daiichi continues to affect the people in Japan. We will explore the efforts made by Tokyo Electric and the Japanese government in the cleanup effort. At the end of our conversation, we're going to take a moment to talk about how Fairewinds listeners can help those affected.
There was a famous quote from a Japanese farmer when the accident happened. He said, I am fighting a dragon I cannot see. And I think that's was true then, and it's true now. The people in the prefecture especially, but then also the people in Japan, received very high radiation exposures, higher than the IAEA is willing to discuss. The evidence is clearly in that the accident released 3 times more radiation in the form of noble gases than compared to Chernobyl, and roughly the same amount of cesium as Chernobyl did. So this is a world-class event that has been downplayed by the Japanese government. So you've got a latency period of 5 to 10 years, and in some cases 30 years, for cancers to develop, which gets me back to fighting the dragon you cannot see. These people have been exposed. We've had guests on the program that talk about the taste of radiation and the smell of radiation. In those circumstances, the exposures were extraordinarily high, and you have to assume that there's an increased probability of cancer. So that's where we're at now. People have to go to bed every night wondering if it's going to be them or the person in the house next to them.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thanks to Arnie and Maggie for your great contribution to my country, Japan, in Fukushima. And Arnie and Helen Caldicott are 2 are most well-known to Japanese people. Now, because I am a Japanese, I live in abroad 40 years, I'm frustrated by the lack of sense of emergency crisis at Fukushima. That's why I'm making an effort to increase public awareness, and particularly political leaders to understand the situation what Arnie talking about. And I'd like to explain more later.
What role are the IAEA and the Japanese government taking in the continuing management of this crisis? Are they acting with enough urgency to protect the people of Japan?
Well, number one, actually there are several political reasons. Since I know UN system, IAEA is primarily UN agencies, but primarily they are promoting energy peace for nuclear power plant. But this time accident, it's a different function from IAEA. But overall, political leader Japan and America as well underestimate the situation, what's happening at Fukushima now. And this is a huge issue the human being never faced. And also this consequences of this radiation, which affect thousands of years. And how do you take responsible to our thousand years for descendant?
With the IAEA's primary objective being promotion of nuclear power around the world, is it not a conflict of interest to have them also be responsible for measuring the levels of radioactivity after the accident at Fukushima Daiichi?
The IAEA does 2 things. The first is weapons proliferation. They go into countries where people have promised not to make bombs to make sure that they are abiding by that promise. 95% of the people who work for IAEA are involved in weapons proliferation. Only 5% are involved in nuclear power. The IAEA's charter number 2, second item on the list, is to promote nuclear power. So while different media groups call it the UN watchdog, in fact, they're the UN lapdog, and they are knowingly chartered by the agencies that fund the UN and the companies behind them to promote nuclear power, not to protect the public. So I think when you hear of an IAEA report out there, you've got to go back to that very fundamental foundation piece, that these guys are promoters and they're not regulators.
Does that prioritizing of promotion end up having a negative impact on the public?
I think.
Yeah. Well, first off, the country was devastated by a tsunami that killed 22,000 people. We have our 9/11 in the United States that killed 3,000 people, and they say we have got our 3/11, which killed 7 times more than yours. So that alone is psychologically devastating to a country. Then on top of that, the next day a nuclear plant blew up, and the next day another nuclear plant blew up, and the next day another nuclear plant blew up. The trauma from the earthquake is compounded by the fact that now 160,000 people can't get back to their homes, not because they're destroyed in the tsunami, but because there's so much radiation that they're not allowed back home yet. Think about it. We're now 26 months out, and people cannot go back to the home they used to live in. It's devastating emotionally to the families. On top of that, while they were home, because the Japanese didn't evacuate soon enough, they were exposed to high levels of radiation, and they have to live with the question, am I going to get a cancer in 5 or 10 years? It has to be gnawing at them.
Are we not already seeing reports of cysts on the thyroid glands of children throughout the prefecture of Fukushima as well as the rest of Japan?
Children already had thyroid cancer removed. And 7 more suspected of having thyroid cancer, just among 38,000 children. So, they are testing more and more children, but the first study already showed that the 3 confirmed cancer. So that's quite alarming. But then what's more concerning is the fact that even today, I just heard on the radio that the UN officially concluded that the cancer derived from Fukushima Daiichi accident will not be increased. I mean, there won't be increased cancer in Japan because of the accident. That was today's report. And I think that really compounds the problem, and especially psychologically damaging to people living in the area, because they know people are getting sick. They know they're sick. They know people are dying. And yet the world has written them off, in a sense, that if they get sick, well, don't blame the accident. It's your fault. And that's what bothers me the most.
This was already happened before, case after Chernobyl accident, that within 5 years UN, IAEA, conclude the same conclusion, that there was no serious case for children. But after 5 years, 10 years, and now there are so many children suffered from thyroid. So Helen Caldicott said, this doesn't appear until 5 years, 10 years. So it is irresponsible that a UN conclude at this point now.
The secrets and the assumptions. I've been saying that since the accident began. 2 days after the accident, a prominent pro-nuclear doctor was out there saying, don't worry, nobody's going to get a cancer. And then he published what he claims to be a scientific story, which supports something that he came to very unscientifically. That's how the industry works. It's important for the industry to say, don't worry, there's not going to be 100,000 cancers. We need to sell you another nuclear plant. And the financial pressures within Japan and within the world to downplay the significance of this accident are absolutely enormous. And that's why Fairewinds is doing what we're doing. We're trying to let the people of Japan know that when they feel sick, it's not in their head. This is a real physical problem caused by that accident.
What is the status of nuclear power right now in Japan? Is it still being viewed as a viable form of energy, and are plants still being sold to other countries around the world?
Well, current government, Liberal Democratic Party, who the one introduced and promoted this nuclear power plant 40, 50 years ago. Now they come back the government power. So they are exporting a nuclear power plant to Turkey or Vietnam or other countries.
And the other part of the status is that within Japan, there were 52 nuclear power plants, or 54 nuclear power plants. Well, Fukushima, Daiichi 1, 2, 3, 4 are never going to come back, so they're down to 50. But also Daiichi 5 and 6 are also in that same category, so now we're down to 48. And they also had Kashiwazaki Kariwa has 7, and they discovered that that's right on an earthquake fault. So what we're seeing is quite a few of the 50 nuclear plants in Japan likely will be unable to start up, even if the ruling party chooses to try to make them start up. Too many of these plants were sited on or near active fault lines. And now, with the new regulator, they finally have somebody with a spine who is telling these plants that you can't operate because you're sitting on an earthquake zone.
The electric companies are barking at that scientific approach, right? And they recently, I can't remember which electric company, but recently there was the official complaint from the electric company about the findings by the commission.
Yeah, what happens is that there's a lot of money on the line, and you can buy a lot of lawyers and a lot of experts to defend your case. And that's exactly what's happening. The electric companies don't want to lose the asset, and are willing to find a supposed expert who will tell them that don't worry, be happy, there's no danger here. That's exactly what Tokyo Electric did when they knew they were going to have a tsunami bigger than 5 meters. They hired experts who made the problem appear to go away until the problem comes, and then.
I also, Arnie, have growing concern nowadays. A seismologist reported last week there is a great chance, more than 70% chance, that strong, huge plate-based earthquake may hit Japan or Tokyo area within 4 years. These are serious additional issue we have to consider.
After the big earthquake in Sumatra, which was a 9, we forget that a couple years later there was an 8.5. So we had the 9.3 off of the coast of Japan that caused the tsunami and the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. But when plates move, they move again. Right. And with that second large movement hasn't come yet. Perhaps it never will. But to bet on that is not a good thing, especially considering how fragile Fukushima Daiichi Unit 3 and Unit 4 are.
And according to calculation of Robert Alvarez, Unit 4 contained cesium-137 radiation, 10 times more than Chernobyl accident, about 5,000 times of Hiroshima bomb. an entire Hiroshima site, the minimum figure Robert Alvarez calculated, the minimum figure is 85 times than Chernobyl, which represent about 50,000 to 100,000 times of Hiroshima bomb.
So you've got an enormous amount of radiation sitting on the roof of a building that's been compromised because it exploded. There's no doubt that the building is not as strong as it was, and in fact there's a bulge at the bottom of a couple of inches called a first mode Euler strut bulge, which is another indication of a seismic problem. We focus on Unit 4 because it has the most and hottest radioactive fuel, but to my mind, Unit 3 is just as bad. It doesn't have quite as much nuclear fuel in it, but it's the one that had the most devastating explosion. So from a seismic standpoint, it's probably more likely to topple. If Unit 4 were to topple, there's more dose consequence. But either way, it's really a bad scenario. You can do two things. You can try to solve it, or you can try to pray that an earthquake doesn't happen. And I think TEPCO's been dragging its feet as far as trying to solve the problem quickly.
And also, Arnie, I wanted to ask you about recent report of water, contaminated water. There are 280,000 tons at the site of Fukushima. And I'm sure this is increasing issue and concern of contaminated waters.
Yeah, there's what happened is that after the earthquake, the entire Fukushima site dropped 1 meter, dropped 3 feet. So in the process, as it drops 3 feet, that increases the water pressure underneath it, and also the foundations were cracked. So you've got groundwater seeping into the building. The groundwater should be uncontaminated, except the containment is not containing. You know, the containment has all of these penetrations for pipes and wires to go through. And there's all sorts of rubber gaskets that prevent the containment from leaking. The radiation exposures and the heat and the explosion were so great that the rubber gaskets have failed. Now, we knew this in 1982. There's a report out that says, watch out for these rubber gaskets on the Mark I design because they're prone to fail. And yet we did nothing about it. So we have a containment that is not containing. And all the radiation in that is now running into the buildings where the groundwater is coming in. So we have highly contaminated water growing at a rate of 400 tons a day. Now, the Daiichi site is loaded with tanks. If you look at the Google Earth pictures of the site, it's a tank farm. It's bigger than a refinery as far as the number of tanks they've got there. What really frightens me is twofold. One, they haven't begun to stop the addition of radioactive water. And two, if there is an earthquake, all those tanks are not seismically qualified. They'll all fail, run into the ocean, and you know the Pacific is a big place, but it's not big enough to handle all that contamination.
Well, then, Arnie, in the case you said it might take 40, 50 years more to contain Fukushima. Then does that mean for another 50 years that we keep this water, contaminated waters, only 2 years now, 280,000 tons. So what happened another 40, 50 years?
One of the plans I proposed back, right at the beginning of the accident, was to build a trench around the plant and fill it with zeolite. Zeolite is a great volcanic substance that absorbs cesium really well. So you could basically build a fence around the plant to prevent the radiation from entering the groundwater. I was told by Japanese officials that it's a great idea, but they didn't have the money. And you can't, this is, Akio mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, that there's the pace at which they're attacking the problem is not sufficient. You can't fight a war on a budget, and this is a war. Now the Japanese are talking about freezing the earth. bringing in refrigeration units and freezing the earth underneath the reactor.
This would be more expensive than what you had suggested early on in the accident. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you have to keep it up. There are examples of freezing the earth. The Leaning Tower of Pisa was leaning a little bit too far, and they were afraid it was going to topple. And so Italian engineers came up with a scheme of freezing the earth, and they pushed it back up a little bit so it wouldn't topple. But a nuclear plant is huge in comparison to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and you would have to maintain that refrigeration system for 30, 40 years. So it's a very expensive solution to a very serious problem.
I have a question to Arnie. People living in Fukushima today, there are many people living in fairly contaminated areas, even though those areas are not classified as evacuation zone. But for instance, city of Koriyama, which has population over, I believe, 300,000, and that's a lot of people. And so somebody that I know from that area, has a Geiger counter, and this person said that the radiation level has gone up actually, and even after 1 year, let's say last fall, maybe radiation level will start to go up again. How do you explain that?
Yeah, there's
good question.
First off, I don't think people should be living in those radiation fields we're experiencing. A lot of Japanese are allowed to go back into these areas when the exposures are 5 millisieverts, which is 500 millirem, and the limit is 20 millisieverts or 2 rem. Those numbers are comparable to what workers get when they work in a nuclear plant for a year. So we're asking people to assume the risk of the exposure of a nuclear worker, but the nuclear worker takes that risk willingly and he's paid for it. Whereas when somebody is forced to go back into their home, there's no risk-reward benefit here. They're not told the risk and they're not compensated for it.
What efforts has the Tokyo Electric Company taken to clean up these contaminated areas?
TEPCO seems to view its responsibility as the site. And, I said when I was in Japan last fall that TEPCO is an operating company. They operate nuclear plants, but they're not an engineering company. And to expect a company to be able to engineer their way out of a problem like this without the engineering expertise is a real problem. Off-site, the cleanup seems to be under the control of the Japanese government. They're paying contractors. The contractors, Asahi Shimbun, has shown that the contractors are picking up the contamination, either taking it into the woods or dumping it into rivers, as opposed to disposing of it properly.
Doesn't that just serve to compound the problem?
Yes, it absolutely compounds the problem. The radiation exposures are going up. And what you're seeing is a lot of this stuff is getting revolatilized. It's in the first couple inches of dust. And when the wind blows, it moves into areas that have been previously cleaned. So the net effect is, unless you tackle a broad area all at once, the way the Japanese are doing it is, well, I walk on this path, therefore I'll clean this path. But as soon as they've cleaned it, if they haven't cleaned, hundreds of meters on either side of it, the contamination will come back. It's a phenomena we saw at Chernobyl as well. What happens there, and this will go on for decades, is that as the cesium works its way down into the soil, the roots bring it back up and into the plant structures, and it shows up in the leaves, which then fall on the ground, and the cycle continues. We're seeing that in cedar buds. This year's outcropping of the cedar pollen was highly contaminated with radiation again. So radiation that is trapped in the soil ends up in the buds and then gets revolatilized. So what we're seeing in all of these areas within Fukushima Prefecture is the revolatilization of material that we had that the Japanese hoped would remain stable. That's not a good hope. Based on his history, they should have known it's going to move. But I really don't think they're willing to spend the money to solve it. Mm-hmm. You know, I've been saying for 2 years now, when I spoke at the press club in February of last year, I said this is a $500 billion problem, and U.S. dollars. And what that means is that, and the Japanese are not accepting that it's a $500 billion problem, because the government wants to sell nuclear plants. And if they all realize they're stuck with a $500 billion in debt, I doubt very much that people would be very willing to fire up another nuclear plant.
Wouldn't it be beneficial to have a group of scientists from all different disciplines come together to discuss a plan to clean up the Fukushima Daiichi site?
I mentioned many times, and I also wrote a letter to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, strongly suggest to establish independent international assessment team composed of nuclear scientists, geologists, seismologists, environment, all this together to look at the totality picture. Because we are confused by so many scientists saying. That's why I only listen to now Arnie and Helen. So I think, what do you think, Arnie, that idea of independent international assessment team?
I think an independent assessment team of international experts is critical. And I understand that the Japanese government does not want that to happen. The truly independent experts I'm talking to are very concerned about the long-term consequences. And the Japanese government just doesn't want that concern to be out there.
Well, it is clear that many scientists no longer support nuclear power in Japan. Many still do. Why is that?
A newspaper called the Asahi Shimbun ran a story about a month ago now. And the headline was 70% of Japanese scientists still support nuclear power. I read that and I said, wow, that means that 30% of Japanese scientists don't support nuclear power, which is a big number. Well, as you go back into the study that they were referring to, it shows that before the accident, only 13% of Japanese scientists thought nuclear was not safe. And now we're at 30. So we have almost a 250% increase in the number of Japanese scientists that are concerned about nuclear power.
And also, Arnie, that I always, whenever I met a political leader in Japan, I'm saying, I'm not talking pro or against nuclear power plant, but I'm drawing their attention to the fact of urgency at Fukushima. And therefore, this situation, of course, we know TEPCO alone cannot solve this issue neither. And they know, TEPCO knows, this is beyond their ability and capacity.
Is this why TEPCO refuses to take ownership over the radiation released by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant?
Well, technology is so complicated, I think. That's why not only international independent assessment team, after that, we need some wisdom together. TEPCO fine, but Vogtle or other expertise on the issue, water contaminated issue, or we have to bring head together, wisdom together.
You know, there is an international precedent on this, and that was 3 Mile Island. The company that owned 3 Mile Island, General Public Utilities, couldn't do it. They could not correct and mitigate the problem. So they brought in a firm, Vogtle, to take over the cleanup. They renounced their responsibility, still continued to support it, but the TMI cleanup couldn't be done by the utility that caused the accident. So we shouldn't be surprised that 4 reactors that are blown up are in the same situation. To expect that TEPCO has the capability of cleaning up the biggest industrial accident in the history of the world is there's a little bit of a stretch of the imagination.
So now, I know that we've talked about a couple possible solutions to clean up the mess at Fukushima Daiichi, and I was wondering if we could discuss a few more. If TEPCO is unable to clean up this mess, and the Japanese government is unwilling to support the cleanup effort in the way that it needs to be supported, what can we do?
What I proposed when I was in Tokyo last August was that TEPCO should be removed. They just are not competent. And a large engineering company should be put in charge. And there are Japanese firms which are outstanding and very large, and American firms and European firms that could do it. But I don't think that's enough. I don't think the Japanese people trust any large international organization, just like the UN, to replace TEPCO. I think there needs to be a group of independent scientists overseeing the international agency. And I'm not suggesting IAEA because they're not independent scientists. But a group of Japanese and American and European scientists that the Japanese people trust should be the watchdog over this large engineering company that's actually doing the work. You know, whether you're pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear, it's in everybody's best interest to get this site cleaned up. And Tokyo Electric is not cutting the mustard.
And then I think American people should understand, eventually this Fukushima disaster, no question, will affect your North America as well. So it is not matter issue of the Fukushima now. It is a global security issue as well.
Who is paying for the cleanup in Japan right now?
Primarily the government. Yeah?
Well, I think so.
Tokyo Electric, I think there's an expectancy on everybody's part that Tokyo Electric's paying for it, but they're essentially in receivership. I mean, they've been nationalized by the Japanese government, and now the funds. TEPCO lost $7 billion last year, but frankly, that's chump change compared to what the total liability is out there. So we're expecting a company with essentially no assets to carry a burden of $500 billion. So what's happening, though, I think, is that the Japanese government is blaming TEPCO, but they're also not giving TEPCO enough money. So you've got a company that's technologically not competent, and you've got a company that may have some better ideas and just isn't getting the money to fund them. So by having an international oversight group, you could put pressure on the Japanese government to free up the funds you need to put the site to sleep. And that effort is inadequate, in my opinion.
It's clear that the west coast of the United States will be affected by the radiation from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. What assistance has the United States government offered Japan in the face of this formidable challenge?
Well, number one, let me clarify. We are facing global disaster, catastrophe, you call it. From that perspective, over 40 years, 50 years, or maybe 100 years, we cannot escape from this fact. So that we have to keep in mind. Now, during 40 years, 50 years, 100 years, this radioactive material or water, contaminated waters, any cases, reach out to your west coast as well. And now, if you account on Japan, government Japan, I can assure you now, they do not take serious action. Japanese Prime Minister doesn't have power like your president. Prime Minister is consensus building power, not decision making power. So therefore, I'd like to ask your government, take it to serious consideration to lead this issue and mobilize international community and to look at this issue and all together. Otherwise, I don't see any hope for better solution at all.
We've been contacted by excellent American firms that are absolutely frustrated by their inability to get into the Japanese market and offer some great cleanup solutions. So there are Americans chomping at the bit to help, and they are being prohibited by internal constraints within Japan from reaching out to help to solve the problem.
But don't you think that the U.S. government has a lot of sway over Japanese government? So in that sense, the fact that Japanese government hasn't made the move almost suggests that that's somewhat of a policy on the part of U.S. government as well, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think I try to avoid any political argument element. I'm making effort to draw the urgency of this issue to the policy maker, both countries, Japan and America. If America remain silent, I almost sure I tell you, 10 years from now, many children, even in your country, may be affected. So I think now the time to bring wisdom head together, to look at this issue, to make better solution.
Well, I think what Akio said is absolutely right. But I think people think that if we get involved, it's an anti-nuclear statement. Whether you like nuclear power or not, it's in everybody's best interest to get that site under control.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That seems like it would be common sense.
It's exactly.
What are the medical and legal ramifications for those who have been displaced and who have become ill since the accident? Chiho, I know you have been to Fukushima recently and met and spoken with many of the residents. Can you tell us a little more about what they are experiencing?
So in terms of government help, in terms of money for people to, say, relocate, I was in an area called Oguni district of Date City, which is in Fukushima. And this particular district was designated as a special sort of a evacuation recommended spot. Or they call it spot, not zone, because household by household got chosen to relocate. And they did get government help to relocate. However, that designation no longer exists. In other words, that whole district is now declassified as a sort of evacuation recommended area. Now, that means the funding from the government for people to relocate stopped coming. So that's what I'm really concerned that this expediting this effort to relocate, bring people back to Fukushima, it seems like there is more money put into that effort rather than helping people stay out. So there's so much money in decontamination, scraping, sort of a construction type of work, but then not enough money for just a small assistance for paying rent or anything like that. There's no money. Once the designation is over, you don't get any money. Is that fair?
For those who have been permanently relocated and who will never be able to return to their homes or their farms, what kind of compensation have they received from TEPCO and the Japanese government?
Well, the woman from Fukushima, from the village of Kawauchi, which was a mandatory evacuation zone for the first, I would say, less than a year, but almost up to a year, the entire village was evacuated. But now, since last year, January 31st, the village was, they declared that the village was not safe for people to go back. So some people have chosen to go back to the village, but according to her, maybe less than 20% of the villagers have returned to date. Anyway, so I asked her how much money she had gotten. And she said that everybody initially got something like maybe $10,000, across the board. Everybody got just initially, but after that she has not seen any payment from anybody. So she's part of a class action lawsuit or maybe compensation, sort of an action against TEPCO, but she has not seen any money.
We have had reports of families being offered as little as $1,600 by TEPCO and the Japanese government when unable to return to their home. It is tragic when people are offered no more than a month's rent or mortgage to replace their whole lives.
Having had to buy new furniture in a new place and all the, moving and stress and the loss of job.
No, I think I'm frustrated to hearing all this economical issue because actually I mentioned to former Prime Minister Hatoyama last year, this is national crisis. How come we can depend on private sectors? Have to have national crisis total budget, extraordinary budget to prepare, to look at the entire picture. But as Arnie said, they just blame TEPCO. TEPCO complain no budget. I don't see any urgency of national crisis.
So they point the finger at each other.
Intentionally they are doing. They are not stupid. They know. They know. That's why I told to former Prime Minister Hatoyama, this is a matter of national crisis. Absolutely. You cannot depend on private sector.
What can our Fairewinds listeners do to help those affected by this tragic accident?
This is a serious, sincere question, but very tough question to answer. Only I like to say is, number one, you, Arnie, and Maggie demonstrating a good example. You are doing for Japan and the rest of the world. And this sincere issue, attitude, very powerful in my country. Therefore, I like to suggest all other country, nation, at whatever level, high school, university, whatever level, they should also educate their leaders. This is the issue of human survival issue, not only now Fukushima issue.
I completely agree that the education, educating oneself and educating each other, because including myself, I did not know anything about radiation until the accident happened. And but it's not impossible to learn, and we have to learn because we are living with that today, regardless of where we are. So the onus is on each of us to learn more about it. And then I think it's scary in a sense, and yet I think by learning, you will probably see what the next step should be taken. It will come to.
Yeah, it's Kaneko-san, as I said, I worked 40 years UN International. We never talk of consequences of this disaster for 100,000 years pattern. This is open eyes. I didn't know anything about nuclear accident issue until this accident happened. But I didn't realize we are taking responsible for 100,000 years for our descendants. We cannot escape from the fact already.
When you turn a nuclear power plant on, there is no off switch. The heat remains for 10 years, and the radiation remains for 100,000 years. So you can't change your mind. Throwing that switch on is a 100,000-year commitment. There is no off switch with nuclear power.
So in another word, we produced a car automobile car without brake. Many scientists say, Akio, we learn from mistake. Yes, it is true. Science technology developed from mistake. But I learned nuclear accident is different. For 100 years, you cannot learn from mistake. It's too late to our descendants.
In closing, we would like to thank our guests for being here today and for lending their voice to this incredibly important issue.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
This has been a wonderful opportunity for the listeners of the Fairewinds Energy Education Podcast to better understand the continuing struggles with the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. Thank you for tuning in this evening. My name is Nathaniel White-Joyle, and this has been a Fairewinds Energy Education Podcast.